Okay, can everyone hear me at the back? Cool. So I was going to start the talk by throwing a bit of a curveball and saying that I've changed the title of the talk somewhat, but you've probably all just seen the presentation notes there, maybe. So this was supposed to be the title of the talk, but I just felt that it didn't really convey a message about TypeScript. It didn't really say why you'd want to use it other than the fact that it was new, and I don't think that's a particularly good reason for using something. So I've decided to change the title of the talk to this: using TypeScript to refactor our application for maintainability and scalability. I just think it gives a better impression of why you'd want to use TypeScript. And when I'm talking about maintainability and scalability, I'm talking purely about the code base. It's not going to do anything to increase your ops capacity, and it's not going to do anything to stop you sort of servers filling up with logs or anything like that. But hopefully what it should do is it should make it a lot easier to work on your code base and a lot easier to grow it, add more features, more developers, etc., etc. So the way I'm going to structure the talk is I'm going to talk about a bit about TypeScript. Has anybody used it before? Only a few. Okay, that's good, I guess. So I'm going to talk a bit about TypeScript and then a bit about refactoring our application, which is this. And then I'll tell you a bit about some of the feedback that we've got from the developers after having worked with it for 12 months now. So this is the application. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what it does, but basically it's a React.js application written in ES5 JavaScript. And basically what it does is it shows all customers of Skybet their bets, and bets are quite complicated. So you've got bets, selections, outcomes, legs, all sorts of things. Doesn't really matter, it just matters that it's like a really complicated structure. So one of the main motivations for using TypeScript was we just wanted something to give us more control over modeling those things. So saying that this field's a number, this field's a date, time, an event has this, all that kind of stuff, and TypeScript gave us that. The other thing was the application was growing. We were adding more developers, more features. It's sort of like 3 years old, and whilst we were okay developing on it, we just felt it needed something to make it a bit more mature and easy to work with. So along came TypeScript. So I'll talk now about a couple of things that TypeScript can do. So this is a TypeScript class. Looks very similar to ES6 classes, and that's because the way that TypeScript's set up, they're aiming to be as close to JavaScript as possible. They're just trying to bolt on the added types and type safety. So I suppose the TypeScript things here, these are arguments to a constructor, and after the arguments here, you've got colon and then the type. So that would mean there that ID is a number, state's a number, etc. And that just means if you try to instantiate that object and you passed in the wrong type of parameter, the TypeScript compiler would kick off and say, no, not supposed to do that. And then the other kind of TypeScript thing is here. So this is a TypeScript shorthand, which you won't find in ES6, I don't believe. But basically what that does, if you put the visibility of an argument to its in the list of arguments to the constructor, if you put the visibility, what it'll do is it'll set that as a property on the object bet every time you instantiate it. And what that means is you don't have to have a constructor full of this.id equals ID. So it just saves a load of boilerplate code there. So like, there's only 4 lines there, but you could imagine if you've got, say, like 10, 15 properties, that saves you a lot of boilerplate code. So you can see that here. So what I've done here is I've instantiated a new bet object there, and I've gone console.log bet dot, and then the IDE has then said, well, you've got these public properties here, event and ID, because they've been set as soon as you've constructed the bet there, which I think is pretty cool. There's some really good IDE support for TypeScript, so even when we started 12 months ago, all the IDEs we were using within the team already had it. So VS Code is by Microsoft, so obviously they support it. IntelliJ's got really good support. I believe Sublime and Atom do as well. So that's nice. Interfaces are actually one of my favorite bits of TypeScript. So the way the code works here is you've got an interface bet, it's got stake and returns, and that basically says anything which is of type interface bet has to have stake returns which are numbers. Now, obviously JavaScript doesn't have interfaces yet, so what happens when you pass this code to the TypeScript compiler is it just uses the interface to say, does your code make sense? And then if it does, it just rips out the interface, so that interface code there will not make an appearance in your JavaScript at all. So coming down a bit further, we've got printBet function. Again, this is similar sort of syntax to the arguments of the constructor. You've got myBet, which is a parameter of type bet. So anything that's passed into that parameter there has to be a type bet, which is this interface. And for me, the cool thing about TypeScript is you can just pass in a blob of JSON. So you don't need to go and write this class implements this interface, have all the sort of boilerplate of creating a class. And I think it's also particularly useful with the use case of JavaScript because you're interfacing with APIs all the time. And if your API is just sending and receiving JSON, you can then in your code say that this API is going to return this interface, and it just sends back a blob of JSON, which I think is really useful. You can use a conventional way. So down here we've got class accumulator bet implements bet. This works, but in this case it doesn't because accumulator bet down here doesn't have these fields. And again, that's something that TypeScript's going to tell you when you try and compile. There we go. Generics. I'm not going to go into too much detail about generics or how they work, but for me this is one of the things which makes the TypeScript and React integration work really well. So our application was React, so it's really important that TypeScript work with React, otherwise we'd have to refactor the whole application code, whereas what we really wanted to do is just get these benefits from TypeScript. So the way that this code here works is we've got an interface for props, and there's also an interface for state. I've not used it in this example, but over there you can see I'm adding the props interface there to the component, and what that means then is inside your component here, TypeScript's going to know exactly what your props look like. So I've done something a bit silly there, and I've done this.props.stake, which is a number, and I've tried to compare it to the date object over there. These are the kind of errors that TypeScript's going to tell you about. It's not going to tell you not going to tell you about every single bug you've made, but it's just going to pick up on these silly things that you might not pick. Hopefully you'd pick up on them, but it catch that. So we're in the situation where we've decided that we like TypeScript. It's going to give us all these cool things. So we've gone to the TypeScript website, and this has become one of my favorite quotes. So TypeScript is a typed superset of JavaScript, and it compiles to plain JavaScript. So has anybody used Sass before? Pretty much everybody then. So my experience of Sass is, say you've got a load of CSS, all you can do is just change, if you're using SCSS, which is a superset of CSS, just change the file extension to SCSS instead of CSS, pass it to your compiler, and basically the same file comes out the other end. And then you can start adding all of the extra sugary stuff that Sass gives you. So we're kind of expecting a similar experience with TypeScript. So I'll come back to that shortly. So this is the way the application's set up. We've got JavaScript application code, node modules, and then we've got a gulp sort of build process, and that just passes the application code off to Babel, transpiles all of our JSX from the React into JavaScript, passes it onto Webpack, and out comes bundle.js. So following similar logic to the Sass stuff, we were hoping that we could literally just rename all of our files to the TypeScript equivalent of the JavaScript one. So TypeScript uses .ts and .tsx instead of .jsx. And then this thing over here is tsloader, which is going to compile all of our TypeScript, or do all the sort of static analysis as well. And then out comes bundle.js. So as far as the website that's using this application is concerned and the users are concerned, everything should be the same. All we're changing is the code to TypeScript. So based on our experiences with Sass, we were kind of expecting this to just work, maybe like a few little problems. This is what we were faced with when we first ran that. I did doesn't really matter what they are, but I did a control F on the number of times the error popped up, and it was about 1,800 different errors, which made it seem pretty daunting at the time. So we sort of set about iterating over the code, trying to improve it, make it valid TypeScript. And this was sort of our process. So I said before, we had ES5 React, so we wanted to make use of the generics that I mentioned before, so we could do this.props, and it knows exactly what the props look like. So the first step to that was convert all of our classes to ES6 syntax instead of the ES5 stuff, so we could use the generics. TypeScript's really strict around static stuff, so if you've got a method which is static, if you're calling something statically, it really wants you to put the static keyword there, otherwise it's going to show an error. I think that was probably one of the main things which popped up, actually. So as we went through all this, we did actually start getting rid of like quite a big chunk at a time, which was quite motivating, I guess. Otherwise we'd probably just quit. The other thing, so just because you're using TypeScript doesn't mean that you can't use JavaScript modules as well. I guess you all use npm daily to sort of bring in third-party code. The way that that works with TypeScript is, and this might have changed actually since we did it, but when we did it, you needed to provide types files, type definition files, and what those files are, they're supplementary files that tell the TypeScript compiler what the JS looks like in terms that TypeScript can understand. Because obviously JavaScript, you can't say this is a number, this is a date time, or whatever. So you have to have a separate TypeScript file which tells the compiler that. But quite a lot of these are available open source, so I've been using TypeScript recently on new applications, and it's very rare these days that I do, well, I'm using Yarn now actually, but it's very rare that I install a package and there's not these type definitions already available just from the open source community. And then the final thing which we had to do was, back 12 months ago, there were some libraries which we didn't have type definitions for. To be honest, some of those are actually internal libraries, so we would have to write our own. And if you can't find open source type definitions, it's reasonably straightforward to actually write your own. So back to the product. We've gone through all this process. We're happy with it in development, and everything as far as the build process is concerned, exactly the same output anyway. So we released it, and this is JavaScript, this is TypeScript. They're slightly fabricated screenshots because they're just copy and paste, but the point is it was absolutely fine. I had absolutely no problems with it going to live, which was pretty good. Considering we changed sort of 150 to 200 files, I was quite impressed with that we didn't make a single mistake, really. But it just goes to show actually how easy it is to port JavaScript to TypeScript. 12 months on, how did it go? So, yeah, back when we released it, it's maybe 10 months ago. But obviously we've been working on it for 12 months because we were obviously refactoring our applications. How did it go? So, recently I thought it'd be a good idea to ask the team, everybody that was using it, how they actually found it, see whether it was actually worthwhile, whether we'd make any different decisions if we were to do it again. I thought this one was quite important. So how easy was TypeScript to pick up? And I put 5 as it was easy once I'd read the documentation. So half the team found it really easy to pick up, the other half were pretty happy with it. And that's good, because if you're trying to introduce a new technology, you want people to be able to pick it up. If you're going to introduce something that nobody's going to be able to use, nobody is going to use it. So there's no point, really. Does TypeScript help you with any of the following? So reading code, that scored well. For me, that ticks the boxes of sort of maintainability of your code base, as well as scalability. This one's truncated, but navigating around the code in your IDE, so that basically means like control-click, and your IDE being able to like reason about your code, which I thought was pretty good for the maintainability, especially as sort of JavaScript applications go. It is much better to have all that static information there for the IDE and whatever analysis tools to actually work out exactly what's going on. This one is finding bugs in code pre-production, and only half of the responses actually said that. I'm not too surprised with that, to be honest, because I mean it's just static analysis. It's not going to help you find all of the bugs. It's just going to stop you from doing silly things, really. And this one at the bottom, so I left the option for other, and somebody else added their own response, and that's just making my code pretty. So I was quite happy with that. Obviously, I had to ask people if there are any problems with TypeScript. So this one, harder to test than vanilla JS. Kinda. So you've got to set a we had to set a preprocessor up for our tests, but one of the ways that we validated that this job had gone well was we ran all of our old unit tests against the code, so we're still using all the same unit tests. We just had to do a tiny bit of work to get them to run. So yeah, it is a little bit, but it's definitely not a deal breaker. I definitely don't have problems testing TypeScript personally. Syntax can be daunting at first if you arrive in a heavily used project. Not sure how I feel about that one personally. I mean, I guess if you jump into a big project and it's in a language you're probably not 100% familiar with, I guess you'd probably think that. But based on that, I think I'm pretty happy to say that it's okay once you've sort of read the docs and had to play around with it. And then this one, some third-party JS libs don't have type definitions. That's what I was talking about before. When you install a third-party JavaScript module, you have to do npm install @types and get the definitions. For me, yes, it's true, but I think this problem's getting better daily because more people are adopting TypeScript and more people are contributing to these open source libraries. And as I say, since when I've used it recently, I've not found instances where I can't get these type definitions. So I think that's going to be less and less of a problem as more and more people adopt TypeScript, which obviously I hope they will. And the final one that I asked the team was, how useful do you find TypeScript? And to give you an idea of the scale on here, I put 5 as if I were creating another JavaScript-based application, I wouldn't use anything other than TypeScript. So if half the squad are saying that and the other half are pretty favorable towards TypeScript, I'd say we did a pretty good job as far as the team was concerned in using TypeScript. So I'd just like to conclude here by saying that I think TypeScript's really good. I think it solves a load of problems. It doesn't solve all of the problems in the world, but it definitely helps you with a lot of things. And also, just because it's like a new technology, if you've got a JavaScript application that you've been using for sort of 2 or 3 years, whatever, it is possible to move it over to TypeScript. You might have a bit of pain getting it over there. I don't think it was that bad, but I definitely think it was worth it to sort of grow in your application in the future. Cool. I think I've got time for questions, Luke. Yeah? Any questions?
What sort of background did you sound contacts the team? So were they, for example, using Java or...
Yeah, good question. Most developers were familiar with PHP and JavaScript, but obviously like a few other people were familiar in other things as well. But the main technologies we were using as part of that team were PHP and JavaScript.
What was it that made you choose TypeScript over some of the
Yeah, so I think at the time it was mainly around, it was more object-oriented, and we had these bet objects which consisted of lots of other objects and lots of other types, and we felt Flow was a bit more functionally sort of aligned. But yeah, we're quite happy with TypeScript, and that was the main reason we used it. I actually asked the squad. I kind of expected a question TypeScript on Flow, so I asked the squad which would they prefer. TypeScript wins. But yeah, we did have a quick look at Flow, and I think there were other areas of our company which were looking at Flow, but they never really got that much traction. Whereas TypeScript, sort of, we had a big team, and now it's split into two, and they're both working on their own TypeScript repos now. Whereas I don't believe anybody's using Flow at the minute, at least to my knowledge, in our company. So I think TypeScript's won that one for us, at least. Any more questions? Yeah.
So that's the majority of people actually on TypeScript in terms of like Sky as a whole, or is it just teams that are up to it?
Sorry, what was that again?
How, only like a few teams that Sky is up to TypeScript, or is it generally everyone uses JavaScript now in TypeScript?
Only a few teams at the minute, unfortunately. I think a lot of people have shown interest in it, but I'm only... no, that's a lie, actually. Sorry. Within our department, there are only a few teams, but there have been other people from a different in a different building that have heard about us using TypeScript and our success, and they've sort of come over and had like consultancy sessions, like, we're thinking of doing this, what was your experience? And they're now using TypeScript as well. So I think they're probably using it more than us now, in fact. I forgot about that because I don't see them very often, but yeah, more people have adopted it. Any more questions? Cool. If you think of any, feel free to tweet me, and I'll try and get back to you. Cool. Thank you.